While cleaning the bedroom, I found lace underwear under the mattress. It belonged to another woman. I said nothing. I simply wrapped it in a beautiful bag. At dinner, I handed my husband his surprise. When he saw it, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Hargreave. Most people called me Dot. I was 68 years old, a retired school teacher, and I had lived in the same cream-colored house on Elmwood Drive in Dayton, Ohio for 41 years. Ronald and I had raised Michael in that house. We had painted every room together, planted the rose bushes along the front walk, worn smooth a path between the kitchen and the back porch where we used to drink our evening coffee. When Ronald died of a heart attack 3 years ago, I stayed. The house was mine. Every creak in the floorboards, every draft from the loose window in the upstairs hallway, mine. I knew that house the way you know a person you have loved for a very long time. I was not a lonely woman. I had my garden, my church group on Thursdays, my neighbor Bev, who came over twice a week for tea, and my granddaughter Lily, Michael's daughter from his first marriage, who called me every Sunday without fail. I had a life. A quiet one, yes, but mine. Michael moved back in 8 months before all of this happened. He showed up on a Tuesday evening with 2 suitcases and a story about how things with Sandra had gotten complicated. Sandra was his second wife, a calm and practical woman I had always liked. They had been married 6 years. I asked him what had happened, and he said, "Mom, I just need a little time to figure things out." He was 44 years old, and he said it the same way he had at 17 when he'd failed his chemistry exam. I made up the guest room and told him he could stay as long as he needed. That was my first mistake. In those early months, things seemed normal enough. Michael came home most evenings around 7, ate dinner with me, watched television, and went to bed. He helped with the yard on weekends. He called it getting his head straight. I believed him because I wanted to, but somewhere around the 3rd month, small things began to change. He started coming home later, 9, 10, sometimes after 11. He began showering immediately upon returning, which Ronald had never done, and which Michael himself had never done before. His phone, which he used to leave on the kitchen counter, never left his hand. Once, I walked into the living room, and he ended a call so quickly that the sudden silence felt like a slammed door. I told myself he was dealing with the divorce proceedings. I told myself stress does strange things to people. Then came the smell. Not perfume exactly. Something lighter. Something that did not belong to my house. I noticed it on the blanket folded over the arm of the couch one Saturday morning. I noticed it on a towel that had been used and rehung in the upstairs bathroom. The guest bathroom. The one attached to Michael's room. I stood in that bathroom for a long moment, holding that towel, telling myself I was imagining things. Was I imagining things? I was not. The morning it happened, I was doing what I always did on the last Saturday of the month, deep cleaning. I stripped the beds. I scrubbed the bathrooms. I aired the rooms. I was in Michael's room. He had gone out early, said he was meeting a friend for breakfast, and I lifted the mattress to tuck in the fitted sheet properly, the way I had always done it, the way my own mother had taught me. That was when I found them. A pair of women's underwear, lace, black, small, folded neatly, as if someone had placed them there deliberately, or perhaps dropped them and never noticed. They were not mine. I was 68 years old, and I had not worn anything like that since before Ronald got sick. They were not Sandra's. Sandra and Michael had been separated for months, and she had never once set foot in my house during that time. They belonged to someone else. A woman I did not know had been in my home, in my guest room. In the bed, I had made up with my own hands. I stood there holding them, and the room seemed to tilt slightly, the way a room does when something you cannot undo has just entered your life. I set the mattress back down. I smoothed the bedspread. I placed the underwear in my cardigan pocket, and I went downstairs, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table where Ronald and I had eaten breakfast every morning for 38 years. And I thought, what kind of woman finds something like this and says nothing? The answer, I decided, was not me. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The tea went cold. The light through the window moved from the east wall to the center of the floor, the way it does when morning tilts toward noon. I did not move. What had I actually lost? I tried to count it the way you count money after a flood, when you need to understand the damage before you can begin to think about what comes next. My home had been used without my knowledge or consent. A stranger had slept in a bed I maintained, had used a bathroom I scrubbed, had walked across floors I had mopped. My son, had looked me in the eyes every evening over the dinner table and lied to me. Not once. For months. He had eaten my cooking and thanked me for it and smiled at me, and all of it had been a performance. How many times had she been here? When I was at church? When I was at Bev's? Had she sat in my kitchen? Had she used my dishes? The fear came then. Not the dramatic, stomach-dropping fear of the movies. Something quieter and colder. The fear of a woman who understands that she has been made a fool of inside her own house. The fear of not knowing how far it had gone, how long it had been happening, and what Michael would do if he knew I had found out. Because I did not yet know what Michael was capable of. That was the honest truth. I knew my son as I had loved him, partially, hopefully, in the particular blind way that mothers love their children. But the man who had been sneaking a woman into my house was not the boy I had raised. Or perhaps he was exactly that boy, grown into himself in ways I had refused to see. I picked up the underwear from the table where I'd set them, and I looked at them again. They were from a store I recognized, a mid-range boutique chain, the kind of place a woman in her early 30s might shop. The lace was intact, the fabric barely worn. She had been here recently. I made a decision there at that table. I was not going to confront Michael with shaking hands and a voice full of tears. That was not who I was. I was a woman who had taught 6th grade for 31 years. I had managed classrooms full of children who tested every boundary. I knew that you did not win by reacting. You won by preparing. I was going to handle this correctly. My first step was simple. I needed to know who she was. A name, a face. Something to make this real and specific, rather than a vague and shameful suspicion. I thought about how one finds out such things at my age, in this era, and the answer came to me with surprising clarity. My granddaughter, Lily. Lily was 23, sharp as a tack, and the only person in Michael's family orbit who was genuinely on my side without qualification. She had grown up mostly with her mother after Michael's first divorce, and she had never had any illusions about her father. She loved him, in the complicated way children love absent parents, but she was not deceived by him. I had always trusted her instincts. I did not call her immediately. I thought first. What would I say? How much would I tell her? I did not want to burden her, and I did not want to use her as a weapon. That was not her role, and she did not deserve it. But I needed another pair of eyes, and I needed someone who could access things I could not. My second step was to understand my legal position. This was my house. I had owned it outright since Ronald and I paid off the mortgage 18 years ago. When Ronald died, the deed transferred to me alone. Michael had no legal claim to the property. His presence here was at my invitation, verbal, informal, with no lease and no agreement. That meant, and I had been careful enough in my years to know this, that his rights as an occupant were limited. I was not trapped. I had options. I wrote these things down in the small notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer, the one I used for grocery lists and phone numbers. I wrote, whose underwear? How long? Who is she? What does Michael want from this arrangement? What are my legal options? And then I wrote one more line, underlined twice. Do not let him know you know. Not yet. That afternoon, when Michael came home from his breakfast, I served him lunch, and I smiled at him, and I asked about his day. He said it was fine. He seemed relaxed, slightly distracted in the pleasant way of a man who has spent the morning exactly where he wanted to be. I watched his face. I memorized it. That evening, after he went upstairs, I went to my sewing room and I took the underwear from my cardigan pocket and I wrapped them carefully in a layer of tissue paper and I placed them in a small decorative gift bag, pale pink with a ribbon handle, the kind I kept for small occasions. I tied the ribbon and I set the bag on the shelf behind my sewing box. It was the beginning of something. I could feel it the way you feel a change in weather, not yet visible, but entirely certain. The following Monday, I drove to the offices of Margaret Hollis, a family law attorney whose card I had kept in my address book for years. A precaution, the kind that sensible women make after watching their friends navigate difficult divorces. I had never needed her before. I needed her now. I sat across from Margaret in her clean, uncluttered office, and I told her the situation plainly. My son was living in my home under an informal arrangement. He had been bringing a woman into the house without my knowledge. I wanted to understand my rights. Margaret was a practical woman in her early 60s, the kind of attorney who does not perform sympathy, but delivers competence, which I valued far more. She told me that, as the sole owner of the property, I had the right to ask Michael to leave with proper notice. 30 days in Ohio, given the length of his stay. She told me that if he refused, I would need to pursue a formal eviction process, which was unpleasant but entirely available to me. She told me to document everything. Document what specifically? I asked. Dates, times, any evidence of unauthorized guests. Anything that establishes that the terms of his stay, even informal ones, have been violated. I thanked her, paid her consultation fee, and drove home feeling the particular steadiness that comes from having a professional confirm that you are not powerless. That same week, I called Lily. I kept it measured. I told her I had some concerns about her father and that I needed her help with something discreet. Lily was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Grandma Dot, I've been worried about you for weeks. What's going on?" I told her about the underwear. I told her about the late returns, the rushed phone calls, the smell that didn't belong. There was a silence on the line, and then Lily said, "His assistant. Her name is Christina Mercer. She's been with him at his office about 2 years." Some of the guys he works with mentioned her to my cousin Jake at Christmas. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to upset you. Christina Mercer, 31 years old, as it turned out. I wrote the name down. Now, I want to be precise about when Michael and Christina realized something had shifted. I believe it began not with anything I said, but with what I stopped saying. I had always been a welcoming presence in my own kitchen. Coffee offered, questions asked, the small choreography of a mother making her son feel at home. Somewhere in that second week after my visit to Margaret, I became quieter. Not cold, not pointed, simply less available, less warm. I moved through the house, attending to my own concerns. Michael noticed. I saw it in the way he watched me at dinner. A slight crease between his eyebrows, the pause before he answered simple questions, as if he was listening for something underneath them. He mentioned twice, almost casually, that I seemed tired. I told him I was sleeping fine. The proof came on a Thursday. I had been careful. I had set up the small security camera I'd ordered online, no bigger than a smoke detector, which is in fact what it resembled, in the upstairs hallway, angled toward the guest room door. I had installed it on a Tuesday while Michael was at work, following the instructions on the packaging with reading glasses perched on my nose, taking my time. I am not a woman who is afraid of technology. I taught myself email in 1997. I managed. On Thursday, Michael told me at breakfast that he had a late meeting and not to wait on dinner for him. I said, of course, not to worry. I went to Bev's for the afternoon. When I came home at 6, the house was quiet. I went to my bedroom, opened my laptop, and reviewed the camera footage. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Michael had come home. He was not alone. The woman who walked into the frame behind him was younger, dark-haired, wearing a belted coat. They went directly into the guest room. The door closed. They left together at 4:45. She was laughing at something he said as they went down the stairs. She touched his arm. I watched the footage 3 times. Then I saved it to a USB drive and placed it in my fireproof safe alongside my deed, my will, and Ronald's death certificate. That was the point of no return. I had documented proof. I had legal advice. I had a name and a face. And I still had the gift bag in the sewing room. Now came the dinner. I planned it for the following Saturday. I told Michael I wanted to cook a proper meal, that I'd been feeling like we hadn't had a real sit-down together in too long. He seemed pleased, relieved even, as though a real conversation from me meant I suspected nothing. He offered to pick up wine. I told him that would be lovely. I spent that Saturday afternoon cooking his favorite meal, pot roast with root vegetables, the recipe I had made for every birthday of his childhood. The house smelled exactly as it always had on special evenings. And when he sat down across from me at the table where Ronald and I had marked 40 years of our life together, I set the pink gift bag next to his wine glass with a small smile. "I found something I think you should have," I said. He looked at the bag. He looked at me. And then, because he was a man who had always believed he could read me and had always been wrong about that, he smiled and reached for it. The smile left his face the moment he parted the tissue paper. I watched it happen the way you watch weather change. First, the confusion, the split second where the brain refuses the information, and then the recognition, slow and terrible. He held the pink bag in both hands, and he stared into it, and the color rose up from his collar and covered his face. "Mom," he started. "I found them under the mattress," I said. My voice was even. I had practiced evenness. About 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting for the right moment. He set the bag down. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not guilt exactly, but calculation. He was deciding which version of this story to tell me. I had seen that look on children who had been caught doing something wrong. I had learned over 31 years to wait it out. "It's not what you think," he said, which is what people say when it is exactly what you think. "Michael." I folded my hands on the table. "I have a camera in the hallway. I have footage from Thursday. I have the name Christina Mercer. I have spoken with a family law attorney. I am not asking you to explain yourself. I am telling you that I know and that you have 30 days to make arrangements to leave this house." The silence that followed was the loudest I had ever sat inside. Then something shifted in him, the calculation hardening into something less polite. "You put a camera in the hallway of my home." "My home," I said. "That's the first thing you need to be clear about." He pushed back from the table. "Mom, you're being completely irrational. I'm going through a divorce. I needed somewhere to... You needed somewhere to bring your girlfriend while your mother cooked your dinners and washed your sheets," I said. "I understand exactly what you needed." He left the table. He went upstairs. I sat there and I finished my pot roast. But that was not the end of it. I had known it would not be the end of it. The next morning, Christina Mercer called my home phone, a number I had not given her. I do not know how she obtained it. Perhaps Michael had told her, or perhaps she had found it somewhere. But there she was, her voice younger than I had imagined, bright with forced calm. She told me that Michael had explained everything, that the situation was complicated, and that she hoped we could speak like two adults. I told her we were speaking like two adults right now, and that I wished her well, but had nothing further to discuss with her. I hung up. 2 hours later, Michael came downstairs and sat across from me in the living room. He had composed himself overnight into something more strategic. He told me that if I pursued this, he would speak to a lawyer about his rights as a long-term occupant. He said he had been here 8 months, had contributed to household expenses, and that there might be grounds for a claim I hadn't considered. His voice was very steady. He had rehearsed this. I looked at him. "I spoke with Margaret Hollis on Monday of last week," I said. "She explained your position to me in some detail. I suggest you speak with your own attorney, and when you do, you can ask them about the footage I have saved." He stared at me for a long moment. Then, "Christina thinks you've been planning this for a while. She thinks you never liked her." "I have never met Christina," I said. "She is welcome to form whatever opinion she likes." He left for work. I sat in the stillness of my living room and I felt, very precisely, the weight of what I had just done. It was not satisfaction yet. It was something more like the feeling after you have pulled a long splinter from your palm, the brief, sharp clarity of a thing removed. That afternoon, Christina appeared at my front door. I watched her through the glass panel before I opened it. She was attractive in the way of a woman who knows she is attractive and has built significant architecture around that knowledge. Dark hair, well-dressed, a little too composed for someone standing on a stranger's porch. She asked if she could come in. I told her I didn't believe that would be useful. She said she only wanted to talk. I told her there was nothing to talk about, and that if she returned to this address again, I would have a record of it. I closed the door. I was shaking slightly when I sat down, not from fear, but from the effort of stillness. I gave myself that. I made a cup of tea, and I sat in Ronald's old armchair, and I let myself shake for 10 minutes. Then I took out my notebook, and I wrote down the date, the time, and the details of both interactions. Documentation. Margaret had told me to document everything. For the next 3 days, I allowed myself to be quiet. I worked in my garden. I went to church on Sunday, and I sat in my pew, and I sang the hymns I had sung since I was a girl. I had dinner with Bev on Tuesday, and I did not tell her everything, but I told her enough that she took my hand across the table and said, "Dorothy Hargreave, you are the strongest woman I know." I was not certain I was strong, but I was certain I was right. And for now, that was enough. The call came on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after the dinner. It was Michael, and his voice had changed registers entirely. Gone was the legal calculation. Gone was the cold strategy. In its place was something I recognized from his childhood. The softened, slightly broken tone he had used at 12 when he wanted something he knew he didn't deserve. He said he had been thinking. He said he was sorry. He said that what he had done was wrong, and that he understood why I was upset, but that I needed to understand that he was in a very difficult place emotionally, that the divorce from Sandra had devastated him more than he'd let on, that Christina had come into his life at a moment of real vulnerability. He used the word vulnerable 3 times. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "I appreciate you saying that, Michael. The 30-day notice stands." A pause. Then, "Mom, this is your son you're talking to." "I know who I'm talking to," I said. He tried a different approach. He said the house was half his in spirit, that he had grown up there, that his father would have wanted him to be able to stay, that he was invoking Ronald's memory felt deliberate and rather breathtaking. I did not flinch. Ronald had been a good man, and a good man would not have wanted his wife manipulated in her own home. "Your father would have been very disappointed," I said, and left it at that. He hung up. I set the phone in its cradle, and I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the rose bushes along the front walk, the ones Ronald and I had planted the spring after Lily was born. They needed pruning. I thought about pruning them in the morning. Across the following week, I became aware that I was being observed. Not in any dramatic way, not in the way of spy films. But Michael had grown watchful in the manner of someone who is waiting for a crack to appear. He was still in the house, after all. We moved around each other in a careful silence that was nothing like the easy quiet of the years before. He noted what time I went out and what time I returned. He asked with elaborate casualness whether I had spoken to anyone about the situation. I told him I had spoken to my attorney, and that was all he needed to know. Christina, as I learned from Lily, had been asking questions of her own. She had apparently reached out to Michael's cousin Jake, Lily's contact from Christmas, trying to determine what family I was close to, what my relationships were like, who might have influence over me. Lily reported this with barely contained fury. I told her to be careful and to stay out of the direct line of it. "Grandma Dot," Lily said, "you shouldn't be going through this alone." She was right, and I had been thinking about the same thing. I had Margaret for legal support. I had Bev for friendship. But there was one more person I needed in my corner, and I had been hesitant to call her because I had wanted to protect her from Michael's anger. Sandra, Michael's soon-to-be ex-wife. The woman he had been married to for 6 years before this unraveling began. I had always liked Sandra, liked her steadiness, her good humor, her patience with Michael's lesser qualities. When they separated, I had mourned it quietly. We had not spoken in 4 months. I called her on a Thursday afternoon. She picked up after 2 rings. "Dorothy," she said, and there was such warmth in her voice that I had to take a breath before I could speak. I told her what I knew. I told her about Christina, about the footage, about Michael's legal posturing and the visits to my door. Sandra was quiet for most of it. When I finished, she said, "I've known about Christina for about 7 months. I have my own documentation." Of course she did. Sandra was a practical woman. We spoke for an hour and a half. We agreed to keep each other informed. We did not speak with bitterness about Michael, or at least we tried not to. And when we slipped into it, we caught each other and pulled back. This was not about bitterness. This was about facts. Clean, documented, legal facts. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my sewing room for a while. The pink gift bag was gone. It had served its purpose. But on the shelf where it had sat, I had placed a small framed photograph of Ronald. He was laughing in it, caught mid-sentence at some family gathering years ago. I looked at it now. I was not alone. I had Sandra. I had Lily. I had Bev. I had Margaret. And I had myself, which, at 68, I had finally learned was enough. They came on a Sunday afternoon, the 2 of them together. I had not expected that. I had imagined Michael might try again alone, or that Christina might send another message through some intermediary. I had not imagined them arriving side by side at my front door. Michael with a bottle of wine, and Christina with a bakery box tied in twine, both of them wearing the careful, earnest expressions of people who have rehearsed. I stood at the door and looked at them. "Mom," Michael said, "we'd like to talk, please." I opened the door, not because I was softened, because I wanted to hear what they had prepared. We sat in the living room, the formal one, not the comfortable back room where I watched television and where Ronald's armchair still sat. I offered nothing. I folded my hands, and I waited. Christina spoke first, which surprised me. She had a practiced openness about her, the kind that is designed to disarm. She said she knew this situation had caused me pain. She said she had enormous respect for me, for what I had built in this house, for who I was to Michael. She said she hoped that with time, we might find a way to understand each other. She said she loved Michael and wanted to be part of his family. It was a competent performance. I looked at her and I thought, "You are 31 years old and you believe that warmth is the same as honesty." I did not say this. I let her finish. Then Michael spoke. He said he had spoken to a lawyer. He said, and here was the architecture of it, the reason they had come together, that he had grounds to claim tenancy rights, that forcing him out might involve a legal process I would find distressing and expensive, and that the last thing either of them wanted was to put me through that. He said this with enormous concern in his voice. He reached across and briefly touched my hand. He said, "Mom, this doesn't have to be a war." "What does it have to be?" I asked. He said it could be a conversation. He said I could let him stay through the divorce proceedings, another 4 or 5 months, and that in that time, Christina would not come to the house. He said after the divorce was settled, he would find his own place. He said we could go back to how things were. And there it was. The offer, the terms. Let us stay, accept the lie, forgive the trespass, and in return, we will behave. They were offering me a manageable humiliation in exchange for peace. I thought about Ronald. I thought about 31 years of teaching children that the truth was not negotiable. I thought about Sandra's voice on the telephone, steady and certain. I thought about Lily, who had never once seen her father truly held accountable for anything. I appreciate you coming, I said. The 30-day notice was issued 17 days ago. You have 13 days remaining. I'd like you to use them to make comfortable arrangements. The mask slipped, not dramatically. Nothing thrown, no raised voices initially, but Christina's carefully assembled openness closed like a shutter. She sat straighter. She looked at Michael, and in that look I saw the actual nature of their partnership. Not two people in love navigating a hard situation, but two people who had made a plan and were watching it fail. "Dorothy," Christina said, and her voice had changed entirely. "You need to think very carefully about what you're doing. Michael has rights here, and if you push this, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you in ways you haven't thought about." "What ways are those?" I asked. She glanced at Michael. He picked it up. He said that if I proceeded with the eviction, he would be forced to contest it, and that during that process, he would have to disclose certain things about my mental and emotional state. My isolation since Ronald's death, my difficulties with technology, the fact that I had installed a surveillance camera in my own home, which he would characterize in the worst possible light. "No one looks good in family court, Mom," he said. "Not even the victim." That word, victim. He had chosen it deliberately as a warning and a diminishment both at once. There was a long moment of silence in my formal living room. I felt, I will admit it, something cold move through me. Not doubt. I was past doubt. But the recognition that he would actually do this, that my son was sitting in the chair across from me and threatening to have my competence questioned in a legal proceeding in order to stay in my house with his girlfriend, that he was willing to use my grief and my solitude and my age as weapons. "I think you should leave now," I said. Michael stood slowly. Christina stood with him. At the door, she turned. She said, "We're trying to be reasonable. You're the one making this difficult." I closed the door. I stood in my entryway until I heard their car pull away. Then I went to my sewing room and I sat down. And I will be honest, my hands were trembling. Not the small shake of effort that I had allowed myself after Christina came to the door the first time, but something deeper. Real fear. The fear of a woman who has just understood that her son is willing to hurt her. But here is what I have learned in 68 years. Fear is not the opposite of courage. Fear is the fuel of it. I was afraid, and I was more certain than I had ever been. I picked up the phone and I called Margaret. Margaret was not surprised by anything I told her about the Sunday visit. She had, she said, encountered this particular strategy before. The threat to raise questions about an elderly homeowner's mental capacity in order to delay or complicate eviction proceedings. She called it, without any particular drama, elder pressure. And she told me it had a name because it happened with enough frequency to have one. She told me we were going to move quickly. The eviction notice had been issued. Michael had not left. We were now in the window where formal proceedings could begin. Margaret filed the paperwork on Monday morning. Simultaneously, at her advice, I made 2 additional calls. The first was to my physician, Dr. Patterson, who had been my doctor for 12 years, and who provided, at my request, a brief letter attesting to my mental acuity, my capacity, and my full understanding of my legal situation. "I do this more than I'd like to," he said, and his voice was careful and kind. The second call was to Sandra's attorney. Sandra, it transpired, had filed for divorce on grounds of infidelity 3 months earlier, grounds she could substantiate with documentation she had assembled quietly and thoroughly over many months. She had text messages, she had records, and she had dates that overlapped with Michael's residency in my home, which meant that the same woman who had been in my guest room had also been documented in Sandra's legal case. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 3 weeks from my call with Margaret. I want to describe what I felt in those 3 weeks because it was not what I might have expected. I had imagined that as the hearing approached, I would grow more anxious, more uncertain. Instead, I grew very calm. The kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the organization of it. All the scattered parts of a situation arranged into a clear shape. Michael remained in the house for those 3 weeks. He was homeless. He came in late, spoke to me in short, functional sentences, and avoided the kitchen when I was in it. Once, I passed him in the upstairs hallway, and he looked at me with an expression I can only describe as bewildered, as if I had become someone he could not quite locate, someone whose coordinates had shifted beyond his calculation. Good, I thought. Let him be bewildered. The day before the hearing, Christina called again. Her tone was different this time, no longer composed, no longer performing warmth. She was calling, she said, because she wanted to give me one last chance to step back from this before things became irreversible. She said Michael was under enormous stress. She said she was worried about what the proceedings would do to him. She said, and I listened carefully to this part, that Michael's employer did not know about the divorce proceedings, and that if certain details became public record, his position might be affected. I said, Christina, I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me. Are you asking me to drop a legal proceeding in order to protect your boyfriend's professional reputation? Silence. All right, I said. I'll see you both tomorrow. I hung up and I finished my dinner. The hearing was in a small courtroom, the kind reserved for civil matters. Pale wood, institutional lighting, the feeling of a place where ordinary human disasters come to be sorted into documents. I wore my navy blue dress and the pearl earrings Ronald had given me for our 30th anniversary. Margaret sat beside me, her briefcase open, her yellow legal pad covered in her small, precise handwriting. Michael came in with his attorney, a younger man with the slightly underprepared air of someone hired quickly. Christina sat in the gallery. She was wearing a coat I recognized from the camera footage, the belted one. The detail struck me as almost literary. Michael's attorney made the expected arguments: long-term occupancy, contribution to household expenses, disruption of established living arrangements. He mentioned, briefly, concerns about my state of mind following my husband's death. He said the word isolation once. Margaret responded with, the deed, in my name alone. The legal notice, properly served and dated. The footage, Dr. Patterson's letter. And then, carefully, the documentation from Sandra's divorce proceedings, not introduced maliciously, but offered as context for the court's understanding of the circumstances that had precipitated my decision. Michael, sitting at his table, went completely still when Sandra's documentation entered the record. I watched his face. His attorney leaned over and they exchanged a rapid, whispered conversation. Then the judge spoke. She was a woman perhaps 10 years younger than me, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the measured patience of someone who has presided over a great many ordinary disasters. She reviewed the materials for what felt like a long time. "The property record is unambiguous," she said. "The notice was properly issued and served. The occupant has not vacated." She looked up. "Are there any genuine grounds for contest here that have not already been addressed?" Michael's attorney started to speak. Michael put a hand on his arm. He looked at me then, directly, fully, for the first time since the dinner with the pink bag. And I looked back at him. I did not look away, and neither did he for a long moment. Then he shook his head. His attorney said, "No, Your Honor, no contest." Michael moved out on a Saturday, 11 days after the hearing. He brought 2 friends with a truck. They came in the morning and they were done by early afternoon. He had accumulated more in 8 months than I would have imagined. Clothes, equipment, the espresso machine he had bought in February that had lived on my counter like a small chrome monument to his occupancy. He packed all of it with a focused efficiency that I recognized as the behavior of a man who cannot allow himself to feel what he is actually feeling. I did not hover. I sat in the backyard with my coffee, and I let them move through the house. Once, I heard something being set down too hard in the kitchen, and I stayed where I was. He found me in the backyard before he left. He stood a few feet away, hands in his jacket pockets. He looked, for the first time in many months, genuinely tired. Not strategic tired, not performed tired, but the real kind. The kind that comes from having held a particular story in your head for a very long time and then having it taken from you. "Mom," he said. I looked at him. I was his mother. I would always be his mother. That had not changed and would not change. But I had learned, in the months just past, that being someone's mother did not obligate me to be their victim. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Michael," I said. "I genuinely do." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, and he walked around the side of the house to the waiting truck. I heard it pull away from the curb. I heard the sound fade down Elmwood Drive and then disappear. The yard was very quiet. The rose bushes needed pruning. I made a mental note about the rose bushes. The legal conclusion came in subsequent weeks. Sandra's divorce was finalized 2 months after the hearing. Infidelity established, documented, and recorded. Michael received a settlement that was considerably less advantageous than it might have been had the proceedings gone differently. Sandra retained the house they had shared, custody arrangements for the dog they'd argued over, and her own financial accounts, which she had wisely maintained separately throughout the marriage. Michael did not lose his job. That had been Christina's overblown threat. But within 3 months of the divorce finalization, word of the circumstances had moved through their professional circle in the particular way that truth moves when it has documentation behind it. He was passed over for a promotion he had been expecting. His supervisor, as Lily reported it, had apparently been a friend of Sandra's family for many years. As for the gift bag, the pink one with the ribbon handle, after the hearing, I returned to my sewing room and I took it down from the shelf. It was empty, of course. The underwear had long since been submitted as an exhibit and returned to me in a labeled envelope and then disposed of without ceremony. I unfolded the bag and smoothed it flat and placed it in my recycling. Some things have done their work and need not be kept. The house settled back into itself in the weeks that followed. I noticed the absence of Michael's particular sounds, his late returns, his footsteps overhead, the specific silence of a presence pretending to be comfortable. And I found that I did not miss them. What I felt in their absence was something I had not expected: spaciousness. The house felt larger. My mornings felt longer. I moved through my own rooms without the underlying hum of monitoring that I had not fully recognized as monitoring until it was gone. I had Bev over for dinner the Friday after Michael left. She brought flowers from her garden and a bottle of wine she described as celebratory. We sat on the back porch until nearly 10 o'clock. I told her all of it, the parts I had held back before, the camera, the court, the look on Michael's face when Sandra's documents appeared in the record. "Dorothy," she said at one point, refilling my glass, "you are something else entirely." I thought about what Ronald would have said, watching all of this unfold. I thought he probably would have been sad about Michael, but I thought he would have recognized me. He had married a woman who did not back down from things that mattered. He had known exactly who he was married to. That comforted me more than almost anything else. Spring came early that year, or perhaps I simply paid more attention to it. I pruned the rose bushes in March, which I had been meaning to do since the autumn. I repainted the guest room, not because anything bad had happened in it exactly, but because I wanted the room to be mine again entirely. And a new color seemed like the right way to accomplish that. I chose a soft green, the color of the early leaves on the maple in the backyard. I did it myself over 2 weekends, with the radio on and the windows open, and when it was done, I stood in the doorway and looked at the room and felt something I can only describe as reclamation. Lily came to visit in April. She stayed for a long weekend, and we cooked together and walked along the river path and talked for many hours about many things: about her work, her friends, her own complicated feelings about her father, which I tried to hold carefully and without judgment. On her last morning, over breakfast, she said, "Grandma Dot, you seem different." "Different how?" I asked. She thought about it. "Lighter," she said. That was accurate. Sandra and I had lunch once a month now, at a small restaurant downtown that she liked. She had taken up running, she told me, and was sleeping better than she had in years. She had redone her kitchen in the house she had kept. She talked about a colleague at work she found interesting. She laughed more easily than I had ever known her to. There is a particular quality of relief that belongs to women who have survived a long, quiet diminishment, a brightness that comes back to them like color returning to a room when the curtains are finally opened. Sandra had that, and Michael. I will be honest about Michael, because he is my son and honesty is what I can offer. He and Christina rented an apartment together, and from what Lily and time revealed, the relationship had the quality of something built on pressure. It had held its shape while the pressure was external, while there was a common adversary and a common goal. When the adversary was gone and the goal was achieved, the shape began to alter. Christina, Lily reported, had expected a different kind of man than Michael turned out to be when no one was watching. The version of Michael that had been thrilling, the secretive one, the one with the dramatic situation, was not the same as the Michael who left his dishes in the sink and came home from work deflated and had little to say in the evenings. By late summer, they had stopped appearing places together. By autumn, Lily heard from Jake that Christina had moved out. Michael, as far as I knew, was living alone in the apartment. He had not called me. I had not called him. That door was not closed. I am his mother, and I do not deal in permanence when it comes to my children. But it was, for now, respectfully shut. He would need to do certain things before he could open it. I had decided that, and I was at peace with it. I joined a new Thursday group, not to replace my church group, but in addition to it. A book club run out of the public library, 7 women, a good mix of ages, very good arguments about the books, and even better conversations about everything else. I had not had that kind of friendship in some years, the kind that is about ideas as much as comfort. I had forgotten how much I liked it. I also, somewhat to my own surprise, began writing. Nothing formal, a journal, a practice that had been Margaret's suggestion during those difficult months. I had kept it up. What I discovered was that I had quite a lot to say, and that the act of saying it on paper gave the events of the past year a shape and a logic they had not always felt like they had while I was living through them. In November, Lily called on a Sunday, as she always did, and she said almost offhandedly that her father had reached out to her for the first time in months. He had not, she said very much. But he had asked how I was. What did you tell him? I asked. I told him you were doing wonderfully, she said. I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, at the rose bushes along the front walk, at the maple tree just losing its last leaves, at the house that had been mine for 41 years, and was mine still, and would remain mine. That was exactly the right thing to say, I told her. I did not set out to win. I set out to know the truth, and then to act on it. What I learned: dignity is not given back. It is retrieved. One quiet, documented step at a time. Being a mother does not mean absorbing damage in silence. A woman of 68, with a notebook and a lawyer, is not powerless. She is formidable. The underwear in that pink bag was never really about underwear. It was about whether I would pretend not to know what I knew. I decided I would not. What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. Share this if it speaks to you. And thank you, truly, for listening.